Welcome and thank you for joining us today. The landscape in the U.S. energy sector has been rapidly evolving since Inauguration Day in January. We've seen dramatic regulatory and commercial proposals, including new trade restrictions and tax regulations that continue to evolve on an almost daily basis. Last night's passage on the tax bill in the House being our most recent example. Energy companies and investors face a constantly shifting landscape. Our focus today is to explore these changes and discuss how recent and proposed U.S. reforms are impacting the energy sector and what it means for your U.S. and your global investment strategy. I'm Mike Bonsignori. I'm a corporate and M&A partner in our Washington, D.C. office and a member of our U.S. energy transactions team, along with my co-panelists, Brian Chappell and Nikki Roberts. Slide 2, please. On the webinar today, we're going to discuss the post-election U.S. energy landscape, the ongoing impacts of tariff and trade considerations, the status of IRA tax credits and incentives, and commercial transactions and project development challenges and opportunities in the U.S. A quick housekeeping note, we are recording this session, so if you'd like a copy or if any of your colleagues would like a copy, please let us know, reach out to us, we will make sure to get that to you. We are also hosting a Q&A chat session, which we will be monitoring throughout the session. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We'll try to get to your question at the end. Slide 3, please. Our panel today consists of Mary Ann Sullivan, a senior counsel in our energy regulatory practice, Jonathan Stoll, a partner in our trade practice, Jamie Wickett, a partner in our global regulatory practice, Nikki Roberts, a partner in our M&A practice, Brian Chappell, a partner in our project finance practice. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's dive right in and begin with an overview of the post-election U.S. energy landscape with Mary Ann Sullivan. Mary Ann?
Thanks very much, Mike. And if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to have a focus here mostly on regulatory developments. And so the first question is, what's new in the Trump administration's approach to energy? And the simple answer is just about everything. There's been a dramatic shift from the Biden administration's laser-like focus on climate change to energy dominance and a clear emphasis on fossil fuels. Governance to date, and we're in early days, has been mostly through executive orders and presidential memoranda, although rulemaking proposals are starting to emerge, and that's important because those are the kinds of documents that have the force of law. Congress is getting into the act, as Mike mentioned, and that's leaving lots of uncertainty about where we're going to finally emerge. There's a clear trend away from enforcement. And I would say the next thing we have to focus on is that we're going to have ongoing change and lots of litigation. The speed of change that executive orders can facilitate comes at the price of increased regulatory uncertainty. So if we can move to the next slide. I want to start with some of the indicators that climate change is out. Next slide. Clear turn away from climate focus. First of all, we have the senior leaders in the administration in this space speaking clearly. The Secretary of Energy has labeled net zero a sinister goal and climate policies irrational. He had said he favors an end to all energy subsidies. I noticed that in his congressional appearance yesterday, he seemed to think there was room for nuclear subsidies and geothermal. The EPA administrator has asserted we're driving a dagger into the heart of climate change religion to drive down the cost of living and unleash American energy. These are not soft statements. EPA is recommending that the 2009 endangerment finding, that is the finding that climate change represents a public health and safety threat, should be rescinded or at a minimum subjected to a significantly affect standard. In other words, harder to meet. It's important to recognize that the endangerment finding has been the basis for many of the earlier climate initiatives. And this is just one of more than a dozen EPA proposals to lighten regulatory burdens on the energy industry, including an end to mandatory greenhouse gas emissions reporting. Another indication that we're not going to be so interested in climate in the near term, the Trump administration has dismissed the scientists working on the National Climate Assessment, which had been seen by experts as the definitive body of research on global warming in the US. And finally, and I know this is of interest to a number of our attendees today, billions in committed federal funding to support the so-called Green New Deal is on hold, pending review for alignment with current priorities. Next slide. More evidence that we're turning away from climate. Federal support for vehicle electrification is disappearing. Charging infrastructure, EV tax credits, battery initiatives, all going out the door. Oil, gas, coal, uranium, and critical mineral development on federal lands are getting priority, including shorter review periods for lease sales. This administration wants to make things happen during their time in office. The question becomes, will industry follow up with the necessary investment? The government can offer federal lands for development, but industry has to spend the money. U.S. support has ended for international climate programs, and the U.S. has withdrawn from the Paris Accord on climate for a second time and abandoned its own so-called nationally determined goals for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. We're currently in a pause on offshore wind energy permitting and great uncertainty about which projects will proceed. I will say recent events suggest that there may be deals to be had in that space. Congress is getting into the act. They're proposing to end the fee on major methane leaks. And the Department of Energy's energy conservation standards are either on hold or rescinded, and enforcement actions seem to be paused. A question that arises is whether these rescissions of previously announced standards violate the statutory anti-backsliding mandate. And we may have some legislative activity in that space. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I mentioned that we're moving to ruling by executive order. Why does that matter at all? Well, first of all, executive orders pop out of the White House without public input or process, unlike legislation and regulation. They can also be changed without public process. Some of the executive orders we've seen to date have been at apparent odds with congressional direction. For example, the funding pauses that I mentioned. And although executive orders do not have the force of law, they are clearly setting policy direction. Again, the speed of change of executive orders comes at the price of increased regulatory uncertainty. Next slide. So what's in the executive orders that we've seen from the Trump administration to date? First of all, they've rescinded all the prior executive orders that supported climate policies. They declared an energy emergency, although there was no clear definition of what that means. They've proposed to limit the historic independence of regulatory agencies like FERC and the NRC, governing natural gas, electricity, and nuclear energy regulation. This could be quite significant. There are 4 different executive orders that seek to promote coal, even though there appears to be a continuing widely held view that coal plants are too expensive to compete in the market, and extending the lives of existing plants are going to meet less than 10% of the projected electricity growth, which I see the numbers are now up to an expectation of 25% by the end of the decade. They've paused for review $15 billion in federal funding for climate initiatives. They've attacked energy conservation standards as limiting consumer choice. Another executive order directs the Secretary of Energy to create a plan for energy dominance focused on production and reliability. And there's a challenge to long accepted state authority for the states to pursue their own climate change agendas. Still to come, I've seen drafts of, but not yet final, for new executive orders that seek to fast track nuclear power plant construction. Next slide. So what are the benefits that are expected to come out of these executive orders? First of all, a resumption of U.S. LNG exports that had been put on hold, and this will have the benefit of reducing global reliance on Russian natural gas. The Trump administration has already issued at least 5 LNG authorizations to non-free trade agreement countries, and reportedly more are coming. There's also a direction to streamline approval of LNG export terminals. Now, until last night, there was a suggestion of new fees for permitting of $1 million for LNG carriers and $10 million for LNG facilities. I think that may have bitten the dust overnight in the Congress. DOE is proposing to ease procedural requirements for exports through a direct final rule. On the other side of the ledger here, EU methane regulation may slow the export initiative because the EU is a major market for U.S. LNG exports. One of the executive orders proposes to dramatically shorten environmental review periods, and I do mean dramatically, from years to perhaps 30 days. This is going to be quite a challenge and will provoke litigation for sure. There's a proposal to review all energy regulations with the goal of sunsetting as many as possible. And Congress also has its own proposal to oversee agency rulemaking through what's referred to as the RAINS Act. I mentioned at the outset the notion of energy dominance. We used to talk about energy independence. I think they are largely focused on the same goals. And this is not a radical change. U.S. energy output was already at a record high under the Biden administration. So as we seek energy dominance, we're starting from a position of strength. There's also a goal of reducing reliance on China for critical minerals, in particular through expedited permitting processes. So next slide, please. A lot of focus on how can we get new energy infrastructure in place. There's been a long-standing recognition that we need new energy infrastructure. Finding consensus around legislative proposals has been tough, so some backdoor approaches are emerging out of the Trump administration. The Department of the Interior, for example, is proposing new interpretations of the permitting laws to dramatically reduce the permitting timelines, as I mentioned. It should be noted that these streamlining proposals are focused mostly on fossil fuels and minerals. They exclude wind, solar, and carbon capture. Again, litigation challenges seem certain. I talked about the energy emergency finding in the executive order. The Army Corps is using that energy emergency finding to justify shortened comment periods for wetlands permits for pipelines. And that is, a lawsuit over that proposal has already been filed. Transmission owners are arguing that competition to build new transmission is costly and inefficient. I think they'd like to be allowed to go forward without such competition. And the Deputy Secretary of Energy has testified that at-the-ready generation, otherwise known as baseload generation, could reduce the need for new power transmission. And I think we need to recognize that battery storage can also reduce the need for new power transmission lines. Next slide, please. The real imperative here is meeting the expected dramatic growth for electricity, artificial intelligence, data centers, and the so-called electrification of everything, manufacturing, building, transportation, are all driving power growth. So the question is, where's that new power going to come from? One very prominent utility CEO says solar and storage have to be the solution because tariffs and other supply chain issues have made natural gas plant equipment too expensive. I have to say his view is not universally held. In a departure from the competitive market structure that we've seen in recent years, maybe even decades now, New Jersey is proposing that cost of service utilities should be allowed to re-enter the generation market. The Brattle Group has pointed to widespread adoption of demand response, energy efficiency, and distributed generation programs by utilities and regional transmission operators. So if the federal government is going to move away from energy efficiency, we're going to see others step in to help close the gap on the demand for new power. And Northeast states are looking to improve regional interconnection. So we're not just talking about interconnection within regions, but across regional barriers. Next slide, please. This administration for sure is all in on coal. I mentioned that there have been 4 different coal executive orders, and they reflect the Trump administration's belief that it's time to reverse the decades-long demand drop for coal. The executive orders seek to reduce impediments to the development of coal on federal lands, rescind regulations that limit the use of federal incentives directed towards investment in coal. That becomes less important if those incentives disappear. They seek to promote coal exports, to direct analysis whether coal that is used for steel production should qualify for the benefits of critical minerals, and whether coal might be used to power data centers. And finally, they support the development of coal-based products and byproducts. I think you can expect to see some Department of Energy research and development in that space. The Secretary of Energy has been directed to identify regions that have unacceptable reserve margins and to use the authority he has under the Federal Power Act to ensure grid reliability, including through life extensions for coal plants. That emergency authority has previously been used very sparingly. EPA has been directed to use its authority to extend by 2 years the deadline for compliance with Clean Air Act standards for dozens of power plants. And an even larger number of industrial plants are now seeking the benefit of those kinds of extensions. The Export-Import Bank, which had been under a prohibition on financing of coal plants overseas, has had that limitation lifted. And finally, there has been a somewhat vague call for appropriate action against state laws that interfere with energy production, and that is being interpreted as prioritizing attacks on laws that address climate change. I think we can expect litigation on actions taken to implement all of these kinds of initiatives. Next slide, please. This administration for sure is all in on nuclear. I think we have to recognize that only 2 nuclear power plants have entered service since the 1990s. Cost overruns and project delays have been the principal stumbling blocks to nuclear growth. But an interesting, different view has recently been expressed. The governor of Massachusetts says building small modular reactors may be the answer to the high cost of power in that state. So she's saying whatever the past history has been, we think small modular reactors can overcome those problems. 4 promised executive orders, not yet final, at least the last time I checked at the end of the day yesterday, seek to support proposals to ease radiation exposure standards and speed NRC licensing processes, end the historic independence of the NRC, giving the White House a greater role, for example, in rulemaking reviews through the OMB. And DOE is under direction to fast track advanced reactors to power data centers and develop advanced reactor designs. And you may have seen the recent proposal for DOE to use some of its large sites to facilitate both advanced reactors and data center development. The Trump administration is also proceeding with Biden administration commitments to create nuclear fuel reserves for both low enriched uranium to meet the needs of existing reactor designs and high assay low enriched uranium, which is designed for to meet the needs for advanced reactor designs that are coming forward. I have to correct this last bullet. DOE's Loan Programs Office had been viewed as promising for reactor financing. Then it appeared to be on the chopping block. And yesterday, the Secretary of Energy expressed strong support for maintaining the Loan Programs Office in his congressional testimony. So I think Loan Programs is probably safe for now. Next slide, please. So what's next? I think continued uncertainty. The oil and gas industry, for sure, is going to continue to be encouraged to drill, baby, drill, even if they don't want to, because new production will reduce already low prices. Policy execution, there are a lot of ideas floating around, but it's going to be hard because federal workforce is being downsized. And that's going to make it hard to get things done where federal approvals are required or federal investment is necessary. And the federal brain drain impact is going to be long-term. This is a lot of very experienced folks who know how to get things done are heading for the doors. The environmental community and states have already sued over many of the policy changes. But creating policy by litigation is less than ideal. You may end up worse off than where you started or with nothing at all. State climate initiatives are continuing, but they vary greatly. And as I've mentioned, this administration seems poised to challenge them. So what should you expect? Expect less regulation, less federal funding for innovation, and less of a climate focus, for sure. Both Congress and the Trump administration share the goal of shrinking the federal government. What can we expect more of? More litigation, ongoing change, and ongoing recalibration. I think we have to give the Trump administration credit for recognizing when proposals bounce in unexpected ways, they have been prepared to step up and say, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Finally, I think we have to recognize that a lot of what's being done now or undone now may be reversed in 4 years. We cannot expect a stable environment for the long haul, which makes it tough for investors. And with that, I'm going to turn the slides over to my colleague, Jonathan Stoll, who's going to talk about the very quiet area of trade and tariffs.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Stoll. I'm the co-director of the firm's international trade practice. It's great to be with you this morning. It's always a tough act to follow my dear friend, Mary Ann Sullivan, who, as you just heard, is a font of knowledge on all things energy, having been the longest serving general counsel in Department of Energy's history. We have 75 lawyers focusing on international trade globally. Needless to say, since the end of the Obama administration, really, we've been extremely busy, but certainly since January 20 of this year, that busyness has taken on an extra challenge with the Trump administration's moves on trade. What I'm going to try to do today is walk through some of the opening moves, talk a little bit about the key personnel in the administration, give you a sense of what tariffs are applying today and what are not, talk a little bit about some of the ongoing investigations that pose key issues for the energy sector, and then leave you with a few thoughts about what's coming next, to the extent that we can, obviously, given the ever-changing dynamics in this area. I guess I would start off with what perhaps is a bold statement, although perhaps not, and that is this is the most significant change in trade rules and trade paradigms since the Bretton Woods agreements of 1947. So, really for the last 80 years or so, since the end of the Second World War, we've lived in a world of increasing rules in which we've had a global framework that countries have followed. That's included the creation of the GATT, the WTO, and other rules that have governed trade. What we're seeing literally in real time, almost day by day, is the unraveling of that framework and that paradigm. That poses major challenges for companies such as yourselves. It also poses major opportunities as countries, and I want to emphasize countries. We're going to talk mostly about the United States today, but the United States is not the only one changing the rules of the road. Our trading partners, friends, and foes are also changing the rules. And so that complexity is giving way to more and more uncertainty, as well as more opportunity as well, as companies and governments seek to see what's going to come next. So let's talk a little bit now about President Trump's opening moves on trade since the inauguration. And I want to emphasize it really was the inauguration, because on that very first day, January 20th, he issued his America First Trade Policy Executive Memorandum, ordering a top-to-bottom review of U.S. trade and investment and international economic policies. He promised more tariffs, and particularly a global supplemental tariff, which we'll talk about a bit later, as well as special tariffs such as Section 301 and Section 232. He talked about the reasons for why he wanted to undergo these changes in U.S. policy. He talked about wanting to raise revenue through U.S. trade enforcement, the idea of going back to the era, unbelievably for some of us, of President McKinley, when a large proportion of U.S. revenue was raised through tariffs. And he talked even about the creation of an external revenue service to do that. In a more traditional vein, he talked about stronger export controls, closing loopholes, and increasing restrictions on foreign investment in the United States, as well as U.S. investment abroad. The president also sought to reevaluate trade relationships, including with some of our most important trading partners, Canada, China, Mexico, and India, among others. He promised a renegotiation of the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. He promised to address unfair trade practices, and then also to review trade relations. He also, consistent with his predecessor, but in a slightly different way, emphasized the economic nationalism of the United States and higher American and buy American policies. And then lastly, he talked about trying to deal with currency manipulation and discriminatory foreign taxes. Now, as the saying goes in Washington, personnel is policy. And so let's talk a little bit about some of the officials who are around the president as he's making decisions on trade. Perhaps at the beginning of the administration, the person we saw most prominently was Secretary Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce. In the most recent days, Secretary Lutnick has been replaced in some extent by Secretary Bissett, who's the Secretary of Treasury. And you also have key players in Ambassador Greer, the United States Trade Representative, Peter Navarro, who serves as Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing, Kevin Hassett, who is the White House National Economic Council Director, and then Susie Wiles, who serves as the White House Chief of Staff. I think it's fair to say, though, that on trade, and this is consistent with the president's messages on the campaign trail, where he promised a lot of the things that we've seen thus far in the 4 months of the administration, as well as in his first term. Really, the decider on trade is the president himself, and we've seen that again and again. The president makes an announcement, or at least suggests an announcement, and then the administration follows. And the president suggests certain priorities that seem to change. For example, punishing China on trade versus trying to make sure that Chinese trade flows continue so as to avoid inflation and those types of things. So, while we have several very important officials on trade and certain messengers and speakers, ultimately it's the president himself who's making the key decisions on trade matters. Now, one of the things that the president did very soon after taking office, somewhat to the surprise of some, was to impose tariffs under the IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, against China, Canada, and Mexico. So you have all three are large trading partners. Two are some of our closest allies, and one is certainly a strategic competitor of the United States. The reason why I point out, and I think it's important to keep that initial move in mind, is that as part of the decision to impose the IEEPA tariffs on those three countries, the administration really announced some very stringent rules on trade that sort of set the framework for what was going to come next. For example, they eliminated the de minimis shipments, meaning small shipments of goods. They said that duty drawback, which is a common scheme used by companies, legally, I should emphasize, to reduce tariff mitigation. Also, foreign trade zones were eliminated as part of the announcement in terms of transforming goods. So these very first IEEPA tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China really set the paradigm for what came next in terms of the president or the administration's actions on trade. And I think, broadly speaking, what they suggested to followers of the administration was, if you think that we're going to have a lot of trade policies that then ultimately will have sort of Swiss cheese holes, we're going to try to avoid that. We'll see as we go through in the next 10 minutes or so whether or not they upheld that, but that certainly was the initial intent of the administration. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of play of tariffs. First of all, we have many overlapping, or at least seemingly overlapping tariffs. Those range from the IEEPA tariffs that I mentioned first on China, Canada, and Mexico, to the global, what we call the reciprocal tariff, which also was put together under IEEPA. And then we have various measures under the national security regime, Section 232, that apply to a wide variety of goods, including steel and derivatives, aluminum and derivatives, as well as automobiles and auto parts. As of today, the reciprocal tariff has been reduced to 10% with respect to all countries, including China, which was certainly, I think, a big development, recent development, and Canadian and Mexican goods, if they are U.S. originating products, are at 0%. We still have the original IEEPA tariff that I mentioned earlier, the fentanyl and migration tariffs, 20% being imposed on China, and 10% on certain goods from Canada and Mexico as well. And then what's really, I think, important for folks in the energy space is what's going to happen with respect to the Section 232 tariffs. As of right now, the primary tariffs that are relevant to you all are the steel and aluminum tariffs of 25%. But as we'll talk about shortly, there are a host of other possible tariffs, including on semiconductors, copper, critical minerals, that could be subject to 25% or some other trade measure as of yet to be determined by the administration. So we have certainly a series of opening moves by the administration, including so-called Liberation Day, the April 2nd announcement of the reciprocal tariffs that are important for energy companies, but really, in some ways, the most important moves on trade have not yet been announced. One thing I want to take the opportunity to remind you of is that all of these Trump administration actions on trade are in addition to existing Section 301, for example, tariffs on Chinese products, as well as the myriad or many anti-dumping and countervailing duty measures that affect energy products. For those of you, particularly in the renewable energy space, but also in the EV battery space, two very important developments just 2 days ago. First, the Commerce Department issued final determination, the International Trade Commission voted in its final determination on solar panels and cells from Southeast Asia. 4 countries were under investigation for the past year. And then also the Commerce Department made its initial findings of tariffs under the countervailing duty investigation with respect to anode material from China, but also anode material, very importantly, that's included from China, that's included in batteries made in China as well as around the world. Both of these two decisions impact, billions and billions of dollars of imports into the United States. So very, very significant, what I would call administrative measures on trade that are not directly controlled by the Trump administration, but that obviously you can see the Trump administration's hand in those measures. So let's return now to some of the general exemptions to the reciprocal tariffs, the so-called Liberation Day tariffs. It's important to point out that, consistent with my comments of a few minutes ago, energy products and resources and certain minerals not available in the United States are excluded from those tariffs. And that was an intentional decision by the administration, essentially to try to put energy products as well as critical minerals and other products in a separate basket for decision making by the administration. And this goes back to my point earlier about key policymakers and in the administration and who will wield final influence, other than the president, of course, over these key tariffs and other measures. The reciprocal tariffs, as well as negotiations between countries, including with Japan, China, the UK, as well as the USMCA region with Canada and Mexico, those negotiations are being led principally by Ambassador Greer from USTR, as well as Secretary of Dissent from Treasury. Whereas these much more particularized decisions in the Section 232 investigation realm, which includes, as I said before, copper, energy products such as declared petroleum, as well as other goods themselves, and rare earths, are all being under the purview, first of Secretary Lutnick, but under Secretary Kessler, who's the head of BIS, which is reviewing all the 232 investigations. So it's very important that when we talk about the reciprocal tariffs and the reciprocal tariff regime, there are exclusions in place for most energy products and resources. Another thing to keep in mind with respect to the exemptions to reciprocal tariffs, as well as others, is the complication around the USMCA. As I said earlier, at the very beginning, when the president imposed tariffs under AIPA on Canada, Mexico, and China, folks thought that this was the beginning, the opening salvo, certainly of trade wars against three of our trade partners. But as we've seen over time, and is consistent with the president's behavior, he did back off, particularly with respect to Canada and Mexico. So there are important exclusions in place for USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement goods from Canada and Mexico. That being said, the rules around those USMCA exceptions are extremely complicated. So it's important that you consult with your attorneys to make sure that you're following the rules closely. And the rules have been changing over time since the beginning of the administration, and they will change again, in my view, as the USMCA is negotiated later this year and in 2026. So right now you have broad exclusions for USMCA goods that are in place, but there are certainly possible going to be changes moving forward. In addition, the president announced in terms of the AIPA tariffs, special rules for Canadian energy resources and critical minerals. Even the goods that were not USMCA originating, the tariff on those goods was reduced to 10%. And that includes crude oil, natural gas liquids, and other uranium products and other key energy products. Also covers critical minerals that the United States needs for manufacturing. So again, very complicated rules that are in place, and important to consult with your attorneys and make sure that you're following the rules properly. One thing that the administration did just a few days ago, actually, and earlier this month, was to clarify what we call tariff stacking. As I said, you have numerous overlapping rules that are in place. And so the administration has sought to clarify when those goods are in place, when certain tariffs are in place with respect to articles that are imported pursuant to certain tariffs. So, for example, goods that are subject to the 232 auto tariffs are not subject to steel and aluminum or the AIPA tariffs. Goods that are subject to AIPA, migration, and fentanyl tariffs on Canada and Mexico are not subject to Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs if they're USMCA compliant. So there's a number of special rules that apply to goods, including in the energy sector, and I think there's a lot of those, where you have multiple tariffs applying to the same good. Very important to consult with your attorneys to make sure you understand which tariffs apply to those goods, because candidly, a lot of it will depend on whether they qualify, for example, for USMCA origination, and also whether they fall within the HDS or the customs classification of particular goods. These are extremely complicated issues. As I said before, we're seeing the greatest changes in trade rules since really 1947, all at one time. And so it's very important that you follow the law, but also we'll want you to put you in the best position that you can to take advantage of rules that are being put in place that, particularly for energy companies, are actually quite beneficial. Now, you might say, this is a lot of action by the president. seems like it should be illegal. How can the president do all this by himself? That's a great question. The answer is that although the U.S. Constitution delegates the authority for tariffs at the border to the U.S. Congress, the Congress over the past, particularly the last 30 years or so, has delegated a lot of authority to the president to impose tariffs. There is a very broad question, in particular, about whether the IEEPA tariffs, the ones that were used to impose the so-called Liberation Day tariffs, as well as the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, whether the president has legal authority to impose those tariffs. There's active litigation in place in the Court of International Trade in New York City. A hearing was actually held on May 13th, last Tuesday, before a 3-judge panel to assess for the first instance whether or not the president has the authority to impose those tariffs and others. We certainly don't know, how the court is going to rule. I think it's fair to say both sides, and I include the government in that, presented strong arguments. But the fact that the court moved very quickly to hear the action means that we expect a decision as soon as, I would say, the end of this month or early next month. And then there will be appeals for certain to the Federal Circuit, which is the next court up. And then we expect ultimately to the Supreme Court on these issues. I think one takeaway from the litigation, you might say, well, look, I don't want to be involved with litigation. I just want to have my business and I want to follow the rules, of course. But I think one takeaway from the litigation is, and from the actions on various tariffs, is it's important to preserve your options for refunds on tariffs. And refunds can include, by the way, certain interest on tariffs that were paid. So you want to consult with your attorneys as well as your customs brokers to make sure that you preserve all of your options in the event that a court should decide that a particular tariff is not valid, or as we've seen, for example, with respect to the IEEPA tariffs, if the president decides to change his mind about how the tariff should be applied, your company may be eligible for refunds, and we certainly want you to be able to take advantage of those. I'm going to move quickly to a few things that are pending, and then I'll wrap up. As I said earlier, I think for the energy sector, beyond the broader tariff structures that I talked about, there are several pending decisions, most of them with the Commerce Department, that have major impact on you. There is a national security investigation ongoing with respect to copper imports, and that's not just copper in raw form. It's also derivative products, which can have major impact on certain materials needed for energy production, as well as batteries and other things. A decision is pending in that action after comments were filed on April 1st. Similarly, important for energy industry, but also for all industries, is critical minerals, including your rare earths, but also other key items that are being used in manufacturing. Certainly for the wind industry, very, very important. You have permanent magnets and other items. Comments were due on May 16 to the Commerce Department, and we expect that BIS, the agency reviewing that, is having active meetings with companies to discuss what kind of tariff measure or other measures should be imposed under that regime. If you have an interest, from my conversations with BIS, they're being very active in encouraging companies to meet with them, to explain the implications of different decisions. So I would urge you, if you have key products at issue, to consider meeting with them or having your industry association meet with them to make sure your views are heard. There's also an active investigation with respect to semiconductors, and not only semiconductors, also any products containing semiconductors. Comments were due on May 7, and again, parties are actively meeting with Undersecretary Kessler and others to talk about whether there should be trade measures imposed, again, not just on the semiconductors, but also on the derivative products, which covers a very wide range of goods, including those used in the energy sector. Lastly, as I said earlier, we have both the activities at Commerce, but we also have ongoing negotiations with many countries around the world. We have a preliminary deal being announced between the U.S. and the U.K., as well as, I would say, sort of a framework deal with China. And there are significant ongoing talks with India, as well as many other major economies. Those negotiations are primarily being conducted by the United States Trade Representative's Office, with input certainly from the Secretary of Treasury and his team. Again, I think if there are key products or key issues on your agenda, the administration is very eager and interested in hearing from U.S. industry. So I would encourage you to coordinate either as a company or with your industry associations to provide input. I know we're about out of time, so I'll give a few a few key points, I think, to wrap up. One, I do not expect the ongoing uncertainty to abate anytime soon. I think the president has made it his mission to change U.S. trade policy, to change the fundamental rules of the road, so to speak. And I think it's important to remember that while the United States is still the largest economy in the world, other economies are acting in kind, and so they are changing the rules as well. So this is an area where you need to have active surveillance of the landscape, and you want to be able to take advantage of opportunities as they come up. The second point, I think, is that there will be major decisions in these key investigations that I mentioned, critical minerals, semiconductors, copper, and others that will impact you. And so you want to keep a close eye on what the Commerce Department does in those key areas. And then the third and perhaps most important thing for you as individual companies is compliance with the law. It's a very challenging landscape. Every day I deal with fascinating questions from my clients. It is important to comply, and what we're seeing is increased investigations, increased scrutiny, increased penalties, unfortunately, by the various agencies responsible for implementing these decisions. So I would encourage you to make sure that you have your houses in order and that you check with your attorneys, whether it's with us or somebody else, to make sure that your protocols and your procedures are in shape. With that, I'm very happy to pass the baton to my good friend, Jamie Wickett.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm Jamie Wickett, partner in the government relations practice. I've been focused on tax law and tax policy for my entire career, which started on Capitol Hill a long time ago, and in particular in the energy and clean energy space. So as you can imagine, things have been very busy lately, and this webinar is very timely, as Michael mentioned at the outset, in that we have just seen the House of Representatives pass the one big, beautiful bill in the wee hours of this morning after a 20-hour markup held in the Rules Committee. This bill includes significant changes, mostly cutbacks to the clean energy tax incentives that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 that were a key sort of a signature achievement of the Biden administration. So in a similar way to what Jonathan described in the trade world, we're really seeing a major shift, a major reversal in terms of U.S. subsidies for energy, and a shift away, to state the obvious. This is consistent with what Marianne was talking about as well, from clean energy sources and back to fossil fuel, and sort of opening the door to fossil fuel options and restricting subsidies or eliminating them entirely for clean energy tax incentives. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So the signature achievements not only were included the IRA, but also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And Marianne talked about a lot of the grant programs under that. Those provided, just to set context of where we were, nearly $2 trillion in subsidies for U.S. clean energy projects. Goldman Sachs, among many others, performed economic analyses indicating that they expected that to result in as much as $3 trillion of U.S. infrastructure investment in the clean energy space by 2032 and $11 trillion by 2050. Needless to say, that infrastructure development is going to be significantly curtailed now with the changes in subsidies and also regulations and the rollback of grant programs in the current administration. It doesn't mean it'll go away entirely. And as I'll explain, it's kind of a mixed bag depending on which kind of resources are being used, what sort of energy facilities. But if we could have the next slide, please. So this obviously we have significant updates as of this morning, and I didn't update the slide deck to reflect the latest. But the broad way to state this is that we believe the Republicans really have a mandate to pass a tax bill, and it is very likely that the Senate will find a way to pass its own tax bill, which will not be the same as the House bill. It'll have some modifications, and that the two houses will come together and get a tax bill to the president, likely by mid-August. The biggest pressure point in terms of timing is that the U.S. Treasury is going to be running up against the debt ceiling. They last estimated sometime in mid-August to September, and that debt ceiling is going to need to be extended by Congress for us to continue to have authority to pay interest on federal obligations. And the Republicans in Congress believe that they won't have Democrats helping to pass a bill to extend the debt ceiling. So that will be included in this big tax reconciliation bill, which means we think the timing of the Senate passage will be sometime in July, and then with a combined House-Senate reconciled bill passing by early August. And, in order to make the numbers work in that bill and limit the impact on the deficit, the Republicans have been looking for whatever they can find in terms of revenue offsets, and the Inflation Reduction Act, excuse me, in particular, among other areas, has been sort of low-hanging fruit at a cost of somewhere close to $1 trillion over 10 years. They have used the cuts in those tax incentives in particular, but also grant programs, to offset the cost of extending other tax items like extending the TCJA income tax rates across the board and other provisions. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So I'll go into the specifics on what has been in the House tax bill. But one important thing to emphasize again is that the Senate will change this bill. Overall, the House tax bill has been fairly rough for the tax incentives, in particular for clean electricity, PTCs and ITCs, for credits like the hydrogen PTC. Although it's been a little better for the nuclear credits and the clean fuel credit and the carbon capture and sequestration credit. So there is fierce lobbying going on, and certainly there will continue to be before the Senate to try to open up those credits a little more, in particular for projects where investments have already been made, that are already under construction, that would otherwise be, where those subsidies would otherwise be terminated under the House bill we just saw passed this morning. Could we have the next slide, please? So this, what I've shown here is largely consistent, although doesn't reflect the changes made in the bill that were just passed this morning. I'll start with the credits. Actually, I'll go backwards a little bit here, but the credits that actually did pretty well under the House bill. The clean fuel production tax credit under 45Z was actually extended. It previously expired at the end of 2027. It's now extended to 2031. The nuclear credits, both the PTC and ITC for advanced nuclear, and the 45U credit for incumbent nuclear, the PTC, both continue to last under the same schedule as they did before. And then the 45Q credit for carbon capture and sequestration also continues to exist through 2031. So basically on the same schedule it did before. And really, those are the credits that among the rest of them did fairly well. For the rest, it's a little bit more bleak. The electric vehicle credits are all terminated at the end of 2025, except for the consumer EV credit for vehicles made by manufacturers that have not already sold 200,000 or more EVs that were qualified for the EV credit since 2009. So the manufacturers that have hit the 200,000 mark include Tesla, GM, Ford, and Toyota. So all other manufacturers technically will have another year through the end of 2026 to be able to sell vehicles that would qualify for the $7,500 per vehicle credit with some other restrictions attached to that. The energy efficiency tax credits for individuals are all going away at the end of 2025. The clean electricity PTC and ITC, the House Rules Committee markup actually made further cuts to those credits as compared to what the Ways and Means Committee had reported last week. Those credits go away for projects that have not begun construction within 60 days of enactment. And then even for those projects that have begun construction, they must be placed in service by the end of 2028 to receive their credits. The hydrogen PTC goes away if you're not under construction by the end of 2025. And then something that is concerning really the entire clean energy industry is these new foreign entity of concern rules. Those include effective within 1 year for projects placed in service in the future for any project that receives material assistance from a Chinese entity including sourcing of components or materials, other than with a small exception for sort of commonly available components and materials. Those would not be eligible for the credit. There is also for projects that pay dividends, royalties, or other payments to Chinese and other prohibited foreign entities, even projects that have already been placed in service in the past. For instance, wind turbines for which there's some sort of payment made to a Chinese or other prohibited foreign entity could actually retroactively lose their PTC for those old facilities. And I'll mention as well the 45X advanced manufacturing credit for producing qualified wind and solar and storage battery components in the U.S. That continues through 2028, so it does have some runway, but transferability of those credits goes away under the amended bill by the end of this year. Tax credit transferability otherwise goes away for projects not under construction by the end of 2027. And I think I'm running short on time here. Needless to say, there's a lot of other detail in the tax bill, and we're obviously happy to discuss that with any of you in the future. We do think a number of Republican senators have indicated support for the IRA incentives and making sure that any changes in this tax bill don't stifle investments that have already been made. And in particular, Senators Murkowski, Tillis, Curtis, and Moran, all Republicans who have expressed support of IRA incentives, we think are going to be fighting to loosen up some of these restrictions and make sure that investments already made in clean energy projects in the U.S. are allowed to go forward. Could I have the next slide, please? So on balance, we do think that the U.S. Senate amendments will be positive, but a lot of these restrictions will stay. There aren't that many sources for revenue offsets in this bill. We also know a number of Senate Republicans are particularly concerned about cuts to Medicaid spending that are included in the House bill just passed this morning. And they will likely reduce those cuts, which will put pressure on to find revenue offset sources from other areas. And again, unfortunately, the IRA credits are low-hanging fruit in that area. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is consistent with what Jonathan was talking about in the trade world, is that, this things could change easily after the next election, after 2026, even if one of the houses changes control back to the Democrats. There will be the need to pass tax bills in those, and perhaps some of these credits will again be extended. Some of the foreign entity of concern rules might be changed to some degree, and then even more so after the 2028 election and the presidential party changes. So we could see, again, a huge shift back to subsidizing clean energy projects. And to emphasize again, these credits aren't going away entirely. A lot of them will remain in some form over at least the next couple of years. And for some, again, like carbon capture and sequestration, the clean fuels credit, and others, we'll see them last at least through 2031, unless those are cut in the Senate bill. So there are some subsidies that will continue. If I could have the next slide. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleagues, Nikki Roberts and Brian Chappell, to talk about the state of project finance and commercial transactions in the energy space in the U.S.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks to all the other presenters. You've really set the foundation for what Brian and I are going to touch on, which is challenges and opportunities in the deal space. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next. So, what we're seeing right now is M&A is in a wait and see mode, and it has been since the inauguration and probably since October, if we're being honest. The energy transition has been a major driver of M&A activity in recent years, but the current environment's leading to hesitation. And, we've heard a lot of the reasons for why that is. Uncertainty surrounding interest, inflation, and how the IRA is going to be impacted long term, including news that came out last night, affect what folks are wanting to do. And investors generally are taking a more conservative approach and waiting for clear signals on the regulatory frameworks around these deals and tax incentives, so there can be financial certainty before committing to long-term investment. The slowdown is particularly pronounced in renewable energy and emerging technologies, where long-term policy stability is just critical for investment. And we've seen that as technologies have come into prominence over the years. But that being said, I think strategic buyers and infrastructure funds are still interested, just taking longer to close with more rigorous due diligence. And also the energy sector is adapting by exploring alternative deal structures. So joint ventures are very popular and have been for the last few years. Minority stake investments, earnouts, different ways of structuring to mitigate risks around this uncertainty. There's also tariffs, loss of incentives, and DOGE. I'm not going to harp on this too much because we've heard an hour of sort of how this is impacting everybody's projects. I will highlight one implication for energy projects in particular, which is that one of the hopes coming out of the Trump administration was permitting reform, in particular for traditional energy, so that it would be easier to get deals done. We've seen a willingness to work with things like deep water ports, but we haven't seen that reform come necessarily for onshore projects yet. I think, another challenge right now is deals becoming political headlines. And so, because energy and energy transactions have become a central focus of political disclosure, particularly in sort of the rhetoric around clean energy and transition. I think in general, companies are applying more scrutiny to what they're choosing to invest in and develop right now, recognizing how that's going to look. The FTC and DOJ have also increased scrutiny on energy mergers under antitrust law. And while public perception and ESG considerations are certainly shaping investment decisions, I think that companies in general are a little bit nervous to be in the spotlight. That being said, there's a lot of opportunity right now in the market. Dry powder it's at record levels. Every conference we've been to, people have, cash burning a hole in their pocket. Private equity and infrastructure funds have just amassed record amounts of capital with significant interest in energy transition investments. And, the general market supports that these energy transition projects are still quite popular, even around the sort of political uncertainty for incentives. That being said, investors are looking for stable long-term returns. I'm not telling anyone something they don't already know there. And while the energy transition offers multiple avenues for that, including grid modernization, storage, and transmission upgrades, I think traditional renewable energy projects probably remain the most attractive to investors, where there's just a stable base and fewer unknowns. That being said, new technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture, small modular nuclear reactors are certainly gaining a lot of headlines and attention. And clients that we have been interested in looking at that, and we've seen sort of an uptick in that. We can't have a webinar without talking about data centers. Anybody who's been to any presentation in the last year has heard about data centers. With the rapid expansion of AI and cloud computing, as well as just sort of the global need for more data. There's just unprecedented demand for data centers. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, we've seen massive power purchase agreements related to their energy needs. And demand's just driving major investment in solar, wind, battery storage, and emerging energy. I had taken wind out of this presentation, but it seems like wind's back in the mix. Which, being from Texas, I'm glad to hear. Also, as always, interest in the voluntary carbon markets. I think, it's not just a U.S. focus here, right? It's a global focus, and so investors with global reach, in particular, have more carbon interests. And I'll mention just here at the end on market challenges and opportunities, sort of a little bit of softening antitrust scrutiny. There's a general feeling that these joint ventures and strategic partnerships in particular scale and share risk, but also that the deal making will increase as the government sort of indicates a easier eye towards antitrust considerations with some of these mega mergers. Brian, I'm going to hand it to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nikki. We can go to the next slide. So we wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about how various participants in the energy market place are dealing with what we've heard for the last hour in terms of uncertainty, in terms of federal support, in terms of tariffs and other trade activities, in terms of tax credits and other tax benefits. And so one important segment of the sector is the equipment suppliers and contractors. We represent both the suppliers, contractors, as well as developers that are negotiating supply and construction and BOP contracts with these parties. And there's a lot of uncertainty. You go back, even a year and a half ago, most equipment supply arrangements, the supplier took, all risk of tariffs, right? They were providing oftentimes a fixed price supply arrangement. Sometimes there was a market component to it, but generally the vast majority of those contracts had the supplier taking, all of the risks of tariff. Now obviously that has changed, and we're seeing a number of different approaches in terms of dealing with that in supply contracts. But generally, suppliers are, recognizing that there's even, now continued uncertainty as to what the applicable tariffs will be, not only at this point in time, but, down the road when they're actually importing, components and materials into the country. So, that's opened up, I'll say, a pricing provision that previously was, almost universally allocated to the suppliers, and now resulting in a sharing or a shifting in some cases of those risks to the purchaser. Labor resources and costs, certainly from a contractor perspective, continues to be a concern. Uncertainty as to where the economy is headed, inflation, recession concerns, and that is driving costs around, especially on the mega projects. In terms of the ability to commit to a fixed price on a very say a multi-billion-dollar deal, or even below sub-billion-dollar deal, in terms of what they can commit to in terms of their labor cost over, say, a 24, 36, 48 month construction period. And so there again, I think, we're seeing a number of different approaches that are being used. Candidly, none of them are new. They've all been used in the past for varying reasons, or to address various uncertainties that have existed in the past. And so I think, ideally, as we get more certainty around some of these issues, it will allow for better price certainty for not only the suppliers and contractors, but for the developers as well. Next slide. And then, we've talked a little bit about the developer aspect as it relates to suppliers and contractors, but, looking at it more holistically, from a developer perspective on an energy project, right? You're looking at, all of your cost inputs that are coming into the equation and into your financial model for a project, in terms of, what it will take to get the project from its current stage ultimately to commercial operation, or ready for service milestone. And part of the challenge is, those costs, as we've talked about, have been fluctuating. But then also, as Jamie so eloquently covered, right? What came out of the Ways and Means Committee was different than what was passed last night. Certainly is going to be different than what will come out of the Senate, and likely will then morph into what becomes the final bill. And that's created a lot of uncertainty in terms of what will be affected, how it will be affected. Will there be certain milestones that can be achieved in order to retain those incentives? That those answers don't yet exist. And so how do we see developers dealing with that? Right now, what we're seeing is, negotiations for existing contracts, let's say for power purchase or other offtake arrangements that have price adjustments or price reopeners, not only for the tax incentives, but also for tariffs as well, and or other change in law impacts. Certainly from an off-taker perspective, something that you'd rather not have But I think, they're seeing it from across the market, and it's not just one or two developers. It's, every developer that they're dealing with facing these same issues. We're also seeing, a trend for projects that, were not sufficiently advanced in their development life cycle, going back and revisiting previously signed contracts and, trying to address these same issues through amendments to existing contracts to provide protection for developers in terms of, these uncertainties as they move forward for projects that they may be delivering in 2026, 2027, and beyond. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Nikki.
Thanks, Brian. Real quick, just going to touch on some key considerations for M&A, given sort of the totality of everything you've heard here today, which is, how are we dealing with the uncertainty? And I think that overwhelmingly, given sort of the regulatory risks, there's just a real increase in diligence, in deal structuring, in weighing all considerations in getting to FID or getting to close right now, and a level of scrutiny that's a little bit unprecedented. So more selective investments, alternative deal structures, touched on this a little bit, but earnout, seller financing, milestone-based payments, where there's just an emphasis on the sharing of risk rather than taking full ownership of project risks. There's also some key tools that have come into play, including tax credit transfers and the market around that. We'll see how that plays out. I learned something today too. And also I think, there will just be increased scrutiny on supply chain risks and certainty. We're just now sort of seeing the initial impacts that tariffs are having on the supply chain. And so I think that over the coming months, we'll see overall how that impacts everything. But it's not all bad news. I mean, people are doing deals. Deals are up. People want to get it done. We're structuring around the uncertainty to get deals done. And so, it's looking like an uptick for the end of 2025 in deals and deal certainty. I know we have some questions in the queue, so I want to leave a few minutes. And so, Mike, I'll pass it back to you so that the team can address those.
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks, everyone. I thought that was very informative, very helpful. Quick plug for anyone else. If you have any other questions, please put them in the chat now. But we do have one or two, and I'm going to read the first one here. To what extent can the states ignore the feds and proceed with mandating greenhouse gas restrictions? Marianne, you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. Let me focus on the power sector. States have long had the authority, mostly through their public utility commissions, to control what power generation gets built. And if they mandate renewable portfolio standards, that has been accepted. I've seen some noise in chatter that the Trump administration may want to start challenging that structure on the theory that it represents an undue burden on interstate commerce. But given the long history of letting states decide what power is going to be generated in their borders, I think that's a heavy lift unless Congress takes further action. So I would expect the states to continue to have a lot of authority in the power sector. I'm going to defer to Jamie Wickett on the vehicle area, because I understand there are some hot developments right out of Congress this morning. So, Jamie?
Thanks, Marianne. And yeah, it's even more recent than the House passage of the tax bill. This morning, I think while we've been talking, the Senate just passed under the Congressional Review Act a repeal of the EPA waiver to California for vehicle emissions rules under the Clean Air Act. The House had passed the same waiver a few weeks ago. And it was, I think one Democrat, apparently Senator Slotkin of Michigan, joined the Republicans to pass that. They only needed a majority vote, but that means that as soon as that is signed by the president, I think it'll be effective immediately. I don't know the details about how, what sort of legal challenge California and the other ZEV states, or at least 5 other states that follow California and adopt the same regime. So I think all of those will go away. A huge change for the auto industry in terms of having to meet really aggressive vehicle emissions standards in California and the other states. And if they don't, they have to buy credits. So it looks like that'll be a fairly immediate change.
I would just point out, and Jamie made this point, it required a waiver for the states to depart from the Clean Air Act provisions and to be more stringent. And it's that waiver that's being withdrawn, apparently.
Exactly.
Great. Another question here. Probably Mary Ann, you probably kick us off as well on this one. So you guys all mentioned about the potential for disruption and this kind of unstable and unsecure time kind of period we're in right now. Of all the areas of regulatory change that you discussed, which one do you think has the greatest potential for the disruption that you talked about?
Climate. I mean, everybody has been focused on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and that is just no longer the focus. And so people who've been planning their investments around a carbon constrained world are in a new space. So that's what I see as clearly the biggest change.
Okay.
And the one likely, if we get a change 4 years from now, to go back to where we were. So more disruption.
Another question posed in our Q&A chat here. Mexico is also in the middle of significant changes on the energy sector with dominance from state energy companies. How do you think Canada and Mexico would fit into the market developments in the near future, or eventually, if approaches from U.S. partners would collide at some point? Jonathan?
That sounds like a Jonathan question to me.
Start that off for us.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Obviously, as I said earlier, we're seeing very significant changes in the paradigm in the trade and investment world, including in energy. I think what I would say, just in terms of the trend of the Trump administration, is that started off, as people expected, very aggressively with Canada and Mexico. But you've seen, I think, a pretty major recalibration towards a North American regional approach with respect to trade and investment. I think a lot of this comes down to the president's desire to renegotiate the USMCA, which, of course, he or his team, anyway, negotiated in the first Trump administration. And so a lot of the rules of the road for Canada and Mexico trade are going to be driven by that renegotiation. You've also seen a shift in Canadian leadership that I think has led to a better relationship between the United States and Canada. And Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico has done a nice job, I think, of handling the president on certain key issues and keeping Mexico out of the line of fire. I think one thing I would just point out, and then I'll have it pass the baton to others, is I think a key issue will be the role of China in North America. I think there'll be a tightening of rules around Chinese supply chains, particularly to Mexico, as the administration, which, by the way, it's consistent with what the Biden administration was trying to do, tries to limit the influence of China and U.S. supply chains, not only directly from China, but also through other U.S. trading partners where U.S. components are being integrated, Chinese components are being integrated into products that are being assembled in other trading partners. So that's a pretty quick overview from my side. Happy to open the floor to others.
Well, I'll just add on the tax incentive side, and to the extent some of the IRA credits remain, and again, I think those will be the restrictions will be loosened a little bit in the Senate bill. I think it's highly likely there will be some FEOC restriction applied to those foreign entity of concern, which will deny the credit for facilities that contain components and materials that have been sourced from China. So that in itself will also result in a shifting of supply chain maybe a denial of credit for a lot of projects that just have no other sources other than China.
Yeah, I think we have time for one final question. I think this will be our last one, and we'll wrap up. To what extent have equity investors pulled out of the market, and are you seeing similar actions on the private credit and bank lending side? Brian, Nikki, maybe you can kick us off on this one.
Sure, I can start, and then Nikki can add her thoughts. I would say that we haven't really seen folks pulling out of, say the U.S. renewables market, for example. I think they are certainly reevaluating their investments in both, in some instances, to maybe move away from certain sectors that are going to be, that are likely to be most adversely impacted. There's certainly certain technologies where the incentives and federal assistance are a key part of making them economical. And so I think those areas are certainly already seeing challenges in terms of attracting investment and lending. But I also think there's an effort to look at new opportunities, right? We've touched a little bit throughout the discussion on nuclear and the opportunities that may exist there. To Nikki's point, the drive of data centers, and also just looking at other opportunities that will open up, whether it's for natural gas or other new technologies. And so I think we're seeing some broadening of scope as well. But Nikki, let you add your thoughts.
Yeah, Brian, I agree with everything you've said, and I don't think it's a pulling out of the market. I think it's a recalibration of investment and where those dollars are going. Part of it is that some of these projects are, 3 to 5 year timelines to really get off the road. And as we saw in the hour and a half we've been on, things are changing really rapidly. So finding something a little more stable makes more sense. I think also there's the feeling of what happens under this administration is likely not permanent energy policy for the U.S. And so folks are still moving forward with projects, understanding that energy transition is not a priority for this administration, but globally there's a push for those types of projects and that type of energy.
Thank you. And I'll just supplement saying we've talked about instability and insecurity and what's going to happen to these projects. In our experience, the private capital market has been flourishing in this area, right? That's how people have been stemming the insecurity. They've been taking private capital to kind of bridge that gap. A lot of bridge loans and other types of loans have been very active in these past few months. So with that, we are at time. I want to thank all our panelists and our group here. Very informative. Thank you very much. Thank you, attendees, for joining. Again, if you'd like the slides, if you'd like the presentation, please email us, let us know. We're happy to pass it along. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long.